Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through the sands of time, where we'll explore one of history's most fascinating and controversial rulers. Tonight, we're traveling back over 3,000 years to ancient Egypt, where a young pharaoh would shake the very foundations of the world's greatest civilization. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful you're here with me on this soothing exploration of Akhenaten and his revolutionary reign that would forever change Egypt. If these gentle historical narratives help you find peace, consider subscribing for more stories that bridge the ancient and modern worlds. Now, let me take you back to a time when the Nile ran golden under Ra's eternal gaze, and the greatest empire on earth was about to face its most radical transformation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone corridors of the royal palace in Thebes as a young prince named Amenhotep stirred from his sleep. The year was approximately 1380 BCE, and Egypt stood at the absolute pinnacle of its power and prosperity. The 18th dynasty had transformed the land of the pharaohs into an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, commanding tribute from vassal kingdoms and striking fear into the hearts of foreign rulers. Prince Amenhotep, who would one day become the heretic king Akhenaten, began each day much like any other member of the royal family. Servants dressed him in the finest linen, their movements precise and reverent as they prepared the future pharaoh for another day in paradise. The palace bustled with activity as hundreds of courtiers, scribes, and attendants went about their carefully choreographed routines, each person playing their small part in maintaining the divine order that had governed Egypt for over a millennium. As the prince walked through the painted halls adorned with scenes of his ancestors' triumphs, he passed walls that told the story of Egyptian supremacy. Here, his great-grandfather, Thutmose III, was depicted receiving tribute from cowering foreign princes. There, his grandfather Amenhotep II was shown as a mighty warrior crushing Egypt's enemies beneath his chariot wheels. These images weren't mere decoration, they were constant reminders of the divine mandate that flowed through royal blood, connecting each pharaoh to the gods themselves. The young prince's education began before dawn each day, in chambers filled with papyrus scrolls and wooden writing boards. His tutors, learned priests from the temple of Amun-Ra, guided him through the complex hieroglyphic texts that would prepare him for rulership. He studied mathematics, learning to calculate the grain yields that fed millions and the tribute that flowed from conquered territories. Geography lessons taught him about the extent of Egyptian influence, from the gold mines of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon. But perhaps most importantly, young Amenhotep learned about the gods. Egyptian religion was not a simple matter of faith, but a complex system that governed every aspect of life, from the flooding of the Nile to the movement of the stars. The pantheon included hundreds of deities, each with specific roles and responsibilities. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky in his solar bark each day, battling the forces of chaos to ensure the world's continued existence. Amun, the hidden one, had become fused with Ra to create Amun-Ra, the king of the gods and the deity most closely associated with pharaonic power. The priests taught the prince that he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and that upon his death he would become one with Osiris, ruler of the underworld. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal truth as far as Egyptian theology was concerned. The pharaoh was a god walking among mortals, the crucial link between the divine realm and the earthly kingdom that maintained cosmic order. As morning turned to afternoon, Prince Amenhotep would often find himself in the palace workshops, observing the skilled artisans who created the beautiful objects that filled royal residences. Master sculptors carved intricate statues from granite and limestone, their chisels bringing life to stone with techniques passed down through generations. Goldsmiths worked precious metals into elaborate jewelry and ceremonial objects, while painters mixed pigments to create the vibrant colors that decorated tomb walls and temple chambers. These workshops weren't merely centers of artistic creation, they were vital components of Egypt's religious and political machinery. Every statue, every painting, every decorative object served to reinforce the pharaoh's divine nature and Egypt's eternal stability. The rigid artistic conventions that governed these works had remained virtually unchanged for centuries, creating a visual language that proclaimed the unchanging nature of Egyptian civilization. The prince learned to read this visual language fluently. He understood that when a pharaoh was depicted with the blue crown, it signified his role as a military commander. The double crown represented his dominion over both Upper and Lower Egypt. The crook and flail in his hands symbolized his roles as shepherd and harvester of his people. These weren't arbitrary symbols, but sacred icons that connected the earthly ruler to cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. Evenings in the palace were times of great ceremony and pageantry. The royal family would gather in the great hall for elaborate feasts that demonstrated Egypt's incredible wealth and sophistication. Tables groaned under the weight of exotic delicacies brought from across the empire. Nubian gold vessels held wine from the finest vineyards, while servants offered dishes prepared with spices from distant lands. Musicians played haunting melodies on harps and flutes, while dancers moved with fluid grace, their performances telling ancient stories of gods and heroes. During these gatherings, Prince Amenhotep observed the complex protocols that governed royal interaction. Foreign ambassadors presented tribute with elaborate ceremonies of submission, prostrating themselves before the divine pharaoh. Egyptian nobles competed for royal attention through displays of wealth and loyalty, their every gesture carefully calculated to maintain or improve their standing at court. The prince noticed how his father, Amenhotep III, seemed to effortlessly command this elaborate social machinery. The king's every word was received as divine pronouncement, his slightest gesture interpreted and acted upon by dozens of attendants. Yet the prince also observed the subtle tensions that existed beneath the surface of royal grandeur. Priests whispered among themselves about theological matters, their discussions touching on questions that seemed to trouble the young prince's developing mind. As night fell over the palace, Prince Amenhotep would often retreat to his private chambers to contemplate the day's lessons and observations. The walls of his room were painted with traditional scenes of the afterlife, showing the soul's journey through the underworld and its eventual resurrection in the presence of the gods. These images, which should have been comforting, sometimes seemed to trouble the young prince in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He found himself questioning aspects of the religious system that others accepted without hesitation. Why were there so many gods when surely divine power should be unified rather than divided? Why did the priests of different temples sometimes disagree about theological matters if they were all serving the same cosmic truth? Why did the elaborate rituals and offerings seem to benefit the priests more than the common people who provided the wealth that supported them? These questions weren't entirely unprecedented in Egyptian thought. Throughout the long history of the civilization, there had been periodic attempts to rationalize and simplify the complex religious system. Some pharaohs had elevated particular deities to positions of supreme importance, while others had emphasized the solar aspects of divinity that seemed to unify different religious traditions. But no previous ruler had pursued such questioning to the radical conclusions that would eventually emerge from Prince Amenhotep's developing theology. The palace library became one of the prince's favorite retreats during these contemplative periods. Here, surrounded by thousands of papyrus scrolls, he could study the wisdom of ages past and explore ideas that weren't necessarily part of his formal education. Ancient texts spoke of the earliest dynasties when pharaohs had been buried in simple mastaba tombs rather than the elaborate pyramids that later became symbols of royal power. Philosophical works discussed the nature of truth, justice, and cosmic order in ways that sometimes challenged conventional understanding. One text that particularly fascinated the young prince was the great hymn to the Aten, a composition that praised the sun disk as the sole source of life and divine power. Unlike the complex theological systems that dominated contemporary religion, this hymn presented a remarkably simple and unified vision of divinity. The Aten wasn't just one god among many, but the singular creative force that brought all life into existence through its life-giving rays. The hymn described how the Aten's light awakened the world each morning, bringing plants to life, inspiring birds to sing, and filling human hearts with joy and energy. When the sun set each evening, the world fell into death-like stillness until the Aten's return brought renewed vitality. This cyclical pattern of death and rebirth seemed to the prince to capture something essential about the nature of existence that was sometimes obscured by more complex theological formulations. As Prince Amenhotep matured into young adulthood, these intellectual and spiritual interests began to influence his participation in royal ceremonies and court life. He still performed his duties with appropriate dignity and reverence, but careful observers noted subtle differences in his approach to traditional practices. During religious festivals, he seemed particularly attentive to solar symbolism, while showing less enthusiasm for rituals dedicated to other deities. His father, Amenhotep III, was entering the twilight of his long and prosperous reign. The elder pharaoh had ruled for nearly 4 decades, presiding over an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity that had allowed Egyptian culture to reach extraordinary heights of sophistication. Under his rule, Egypt had become the undisputed superpower of the ancient world, its influence extending far beyond its borders through diplomatic alliances, economic partnerships, and cultural exchanges. Yet this very success may have contributed to the spiritual restlessness that was developing in his son and heir. When survival and expansion were constant concerns, there was little time for theological speculation. But in an age of security and abundance, minds naturally turned to deeper questions about meaning and purpose. The prince found himself wondering whether Egypt's great achievements were truly as eternal and divinely ordained as traditional teachings suggested. The question of succession was becoming increasingly urgent as Amenhotep III's health began to show signs of decline. Court physicians did their best to maintain the king's vitality through elaborate medical treatments and magical rituals, but the passage of time was inexorable. Soon the young prince would need to assume the full responsibilities of pharaonic rule, taking his place in the long line of god-kings who had maintained Egypt's greatness for over a millennium. But the prince who would soon become Amenhotep IV, and later transform himself into Akhenaten, was already developing ideas that would challenge everything his ancestors had built. The seeds of revolution were taking root in his mind, nourished by genuine spiritual seeking, and perhaps by a growing sense that the traditional system, for all its grandeur and success, was somehow incomplete or even fundamentally flawed. The stage was being set for one of history's most dramatic religious and political upheavals, as a young man prepared to abandon the wisdom of ages in favor of a radically new vision of divine truth and royal authority. The transformation began subtly, like the first whisper of wind that signals a coming storm. As Prince Amenhotep entered his 20th year, the court began to notice changes in his demeanor that went beyond typical royal maturation. During morning audiences with foreign dignitaries, he would focus intently on the golden solar disk that adorned the throne room ceiling, his gaze lingering there even as ambassadors presented their elaborate tributes and diplomatic messages. The prince's personal quarters underwent gradual but significant modifications during this period. Where once traditional images of Amun-Ra and other established deities had decorated his walls, new paintings began to appear featuring the sun disk, surrounded by rays that ended in tiny hands, each hand extending the Ankh symbol of life toward the earth below. These artistic changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate controversy, but they represented the first visible signs of the theological revolution brewing in the young man's mind. His daily routine began to reflect these evolving spiritual convictions. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the palace windows, the prince would position himself where he could observe the sun's emergence over the eastern horizon. This wasn't the casual appreciation of natural beauty that might characterize any cultured person, but rather an intense, almost mystical communion with what he was beginning to understand as the sole source of divine power and cosmic truth. The palace servants, trained to observe royal preferences, with microscopic attention to detail, noted that the prince increasingly requested that his meals be served in courtyards and gardens where natural sunlight could illuminate his food and drink. He seemed to find particular satisfaction in breaking his fast, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, as if drawing physical and spiritual nourishment simultaneously from earthly sustenance and celestial energy. These behavioral changes coincided with significant developments in the prince's intellectual life. His private library expanded to include texts from various regions of the empire, many of them exploring philosophical and theological concepts that differed markedly from traditional Egyptian religious thought. Scrolls from Mesopotamia discussed monotheistic tendencies in certain regional cults, while documents from the Levant explored the worship of solar deities that bore striking similarities to the Aten concept that was captivating the prince's imagination. The young royal's conversations with his tutors and advisors began to take on a distinctly different character during this formative period. Where once he had accepted traditional explanations of religious mysteries with appropriate reverence, he now posed increasingly challenging questions that made even learned priests uncomfortable. Why, he wondered aloud, should divine power be fragmented among hundreds of different deities when the sun's life-giving energy seemed to demonstrate that all creative force emanated from a single source? His questioning extended beyond purely theological matters to encompass the social and political implications of religious belief. The prince observed that the complex pantheon of Egyptian gods required an enormous priestly bureaucracy to maintain their various cults, temples, and rituals. Thousands of priests devoted their lives to serving different deities, often in ways that seemed to compete with rather than complement each other. The resources devoted to maintaining this elaborate religious infrastructure were staggering, involving vast quantities of gold, grain, livestock, and human labor. Meanwhile, the common people of Egypt, who ultimately provided the wealth that supported both the royal court and the priestly establishment, seemed to derive relatively little direct benefit from the complex theological system they were required to support through their taxes and labor. The prince began to envision a simpler, more direct relationship between divinity and humanity that would eliminate unnecessary intermediaries and focus spiritual energy on the single source of all life and power. These revolutionary ideas remained largely private during the final years of Amenhotep III's reign, but they profoundly influenced the prince's preparation for eventual kingship. He began to surround himself with advisors and companions who shared his interest in religious reform, carefully selecting individuals who combined traditional Egyptian wisdom with openness to innovative theological concepts. Among these emerging confidants was a remarkable woman named Nefertiti, whose name meant "the beautiful one has come." She possessed not only extraordinary physical beauty, but also an intellectual sophistication and spiritual sensitivity that made her an ideal partner for the prince's revolutionary vision. Their courtship and marriage would prove to be far more than a typical royal alliance, becoming instead a profound spiritual partnership that would help reshape Egyptian civilization. Nefertiti brought her own insights and perspectives to the theological discussions that increasingly dominated the prince's inner circle. Her understanding of the feminine aspects of divinity helped expand his conception of the Aten beyond purely masculine solar symbolism to encompass the nurturing, life-giving qualities traditionally associated with goddess figures in Egyptian religion. Together, they developed a theological framework that honored both the power and the compassion of the singular divine force they believed governed all existence. The couple spent countless hours in gardens and courtyards, observing the effects of sunlight on plants, animals, and human beings. They noticed how flowers turned to follow the sun's path across the sky, how birds sang most joyfully during the bright hours of daylight, and how human faces seemed to glow with particular warmth and vitality when illuminated by natural solar radiance. These observations reinforced their growing conviction that the sun disk was indeed the visible manifestation of the supreme divine power that created and sustained all life. As Amenhotep III's health continued to decline, court attention increasingly focused on the prince's readiness to assume full royal responsibilities. The traditional succession process required the heir to demonstrate mastery of various kingly arts, including military leadership, diplomatic negotiation, religious ceremony, and administrative oversight. The prince performed adequately in all these areas, but careful observers noted that his heart seemed most engaged when dealing with matters that touched on his evolving theological interests. During military exercises, for instance, he showed particular fascination with the strategic implications of timing attacks to coincide with optimal solar conditions. His approach to diplomatic negotiations emphasized concepts of truth and cosmic order that reflected his developing religious philosophy. Most significantly, his participation in traditional religious ceremonies began to subtly emphasize solar symbolism, while downplaying the roles of other deities in ways that suggested significant changes might be coming. The prince's artistic patronage during this period also reflected his evolving spiritual vision. He commissioned sculptors and painters to create works that departed from traditional Egyptian artistic conventions in favor of more naturalistic representations of human figures and natural scenes. These artistic innovations weren't merely aesthetic preferences, but expressed deeper theological convictions about the importance of truth and authenticity in representing divine creation. Traditional Egyptian art had always emphasized eternal, idealized forms that symbolized the unchanging nature of cosmic order. Pharaohs were depicted according to strict conventions that had remained virtually unchanged for centuries, their bodies conforming to mathematical proportions that reflected theological rather than anatomical truth. The prince began to encourage artists to observe and represent the natural world more directly, believing that honest depiction of divine creation was more spiritually authentic than adherence to artificial conventions. These artistic innovations extended to architectural projects as well. The prince began planning temple designs that would maximize natural illumination, creating sacred spaces where worshippers could experience direct connection with the Aten's life-giving rays. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples, which were often dark, mysterious spaces designed to emphasize the hidden nature of divine power, these new structures would be open, bright, and welcoming, reflecting the prince's belief that divine truth should be accessible to all people, rather than hidden behind priestly mysteries. The intellectual and spiritual transformation occurring within the prince was paralleled by significant changes in the broader Egyptian society. The long peace and prosperity of Amenhotep III's reign had created conditions that encouraged philosophical speculation and religious experimentation. Prosperity had freed many people from the immediate concerns of survival, allowing them to contemplate deeper questions about meaning and purpose. International trade and diplomatic contact had exposed Egyptians to foreign ideas and practices that challenged traditional assumptions about the unique superiority of their civilization. Some scholars and priests had begun to question whether the complex religious system that had served Egypt for centuries was still adequate for the challenges of a more cosmopolitan age. Foreign influences were subtly affecting Egyptian culture in ways that made some traditional practices seem provincial or outdated. The prince's revolutionary ideas, while still radical, were emerging in a cultural context that was increasingly receptive to innovation and change. Yet the forces of tradition remained enormously powerful throughout Egyptian society. The priestly establishments of major temples controlled vast wealth and wielded significant political influence that would not be easily challenged or displaced. Aristocratic families had built their identities and power structures around the existing religious and political system. making them natural opponents of any radical changes. The common people, while potentially benefiting from religious simplification, were deeply attached to traditional practices and beliefs that had provided comfort and meaning for countless generations. The stage was thus set for an extraordinary confrontation between revolutionary vision and established tradition, between innovative theology and ancient wisdom, between the dreams of a young idealist and the entrenched interests of one of history's most conservative civilizations. The death of Amenhotep III. In 1353 BCE marked more than the end of a reign. It signaled the beginning of the most radical transformation in Egyptian history. As the royal morticians prepared the great pharaoh's body for its eternal journey, his son stood in the palace courtyard, watching the morning sun climb above the Theban hills. The young man who had been Prince Amenhotep was about to become Amenhotep IV, but even that name would not survive the revolutionary changes he was planning. The coronation ceremony unfolded with all the ancient splendor that Egyptian tradition demanded. In the great temple of Karnak, surrounded by towering columns covered in hieroglyphs that proclaimed the eternal power of Amun-Ra, the new pharaoh received the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The high priest of Amun performed the sacred rituals that had transformed mortals into god-kings for over 1,000 years, anointing the young ruler with holy oils, while reciting prayers that connected him to the divine realm. Yet even as he participated in these time-honored ceremonies, Amenhotep IV's mind was already focused on the changes he intended to implement. As the priest placed the ceremonial beard of divine kingship on his chin, the new pharaoh gazed upward through the temple's open roof toward the sun disk that he increasingly understood to be the true source of all divine power. The irony was not lost on him that he was being invested with authority in the name of gods he no longer believed possessed ultimate reality. The first months of his reign proceeded with deceptive normalcy. Foreign ambassadors continued to arrive with tribute and diplomatic messages, prostrating themselves before the throne in rituals that had changed little since the time of the pyramids. Administrative officials went about their daily tasks of collecting taxes, organizing building projects, and maintaining the vast bureaucratic machinery that kept the empire functioning. To most observers, the new pharaoh seemed to be settling into his role with appropriate dignity and competence. But careful watchers began to notice subtle shifts in royal behavior and preferences. During morning audiences, Amenhotep IV would often pause in his deliberations to observe the changing patterns of sunlight as it moved across the throne room floor. He seemed particularly attentive to the way natural illumination transformed the appearance of people and objects, as if seeking some deeper truth in the play of light and shadow. The pharaoh's daily schedule gradually evolved to maximize his exposure to direct sunlight. Royal meals were increasingly served on open terraces rather than in enclosed dining halls. Administrative meetings were moved to courtyards and gardens where participants could conduct business under the open sky. These changes were initially dismissed as personal preferences, but they reflected the king's growing conviction that proximity to the sun's rays was essential for spiritual and physical well-being. His artistic commissions during this early period began to diverge noticeably from traditional Egyptian conventions. Where previous pharaohs had ordered statues and reliefs that depicted them according to idealized, timeless formulas, Amenhotep IV encouraged artists to observe and represent the natural world with unprecedented accuracy. Royal portraits began to show the pharaoh's actual physical features rather than conforming to conventional representations of divine kingship. These artistic innovations extended beyond mere portraiture to encompass entirely new ways of depicting human relationships and natural phenomena. Court artists were instructed to pay careful attention to the effects of sunlight on their subjects, creating works that captured the warmth and vitality that solar illumination seemed to bring to all living things. The stiff, formal poses that had characterized Egyptian art for centuries gave way to more relaxed, naturalistic representations that emphasized movement, emotion, and the beauty of everyday life. The pharaoh's personal living quarters underwent significant modifications during this transitional period. Traditional religious imagery was gradually replaced with decorations featuring the sun disk surrounded by rays that ended in small hands, each hand extending life symbols toward the earth below. These artistic elements weren't merely decorative, but represented a sophisticated theological statement about the nature of divine power and its relationship to earthly existence. Nefertiti played an increasingly prominent role in these developments, appearing alongside her husband in artistic representations with a frequency and prominence that was unprecedented for Egyptian royal art. Traditional conventions had typically shown the pharaoh as the dominant figure in any composition, with other family members depicted in smaller scale to emphasize their subordinate status. But the new artistic style emerging under Amenhotep IV portrayed the royal couple as partners, often shown sharing intimate moments under the beneficent rays of the sun disk. The queen's influence extended far beyond artistic representation into the realm of religious and philosophical development. Her intelligence and spiritual sensitivity made her an ideal collaborator in the theological innovations that were beginning to reshape royal thinking about divinity and cosmic order. Together, the royal couple spent long hours in contemplation and discussion, developing the intellectual framework for what would become one of history's most radical religious revolutions. Their private conversations, conducted in garden pavilions designed to maximize natural illumination, ranged across topics that challenged fundamental assumptions about Egyptian religion and society. They questioned why divine power should be fragmented among hundreds of different deities, when observation of the natural world suggested that all life and energy emanated from a single source. They wondered whether the elaborate priestly bureaucracy that maintained the various temple cults was truly necessary for spiritual communion with divine truth. These discussions weren't merely abstract theological speculation, but reflected practical concerns about the efficiency and authenticity of Egypt's religious system. The royal couple observed that the complex pantheon of gods required enormous resources to maintain, diverting wealth and labor from projects that might more directly benefit the Egyptian people. They noted that the mysteries and secrets that surrounded traditional religious practices seemed designed more to enhance priestly authority than to facilitate genuine spiritual understanding. As their theological vision crystallized, Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti began to envision a radically simplified religious system centered on direct worship of the Aten, the solar disk that they increasingly understood to be the visible manifestation of the supreme divine power. This wasn't merely sun worship in the primitive sense, but a sophisticated monotheistic theology that recognized the sun as the source of all life, energy, and creative force in the universe. The Aten, as they conceived it, was both transcendent and immanent, existing beyond the physical world while simultaneously manifesting through the life-giving properties of solar radiation. Every ray of sunlight was understood to be a direct emanation of divine power, bringing vitality to plants, warmth to animals, and joy to human hearts. The cyclical pattern of sunrise and sunset represented the eternal rhythm of death and rebirth that governed all existence. This theological framework had profound implications for understanding human relationships with divinity. If the Aten was the sole source of divine power, then elaborate priestly mediation was unnecessary for spiritual communion. Individual believers could establish direct relationships with the divine simply by opening themselves to the sun's beneficent influence. This democratization of religious experience threatened to undermine the authority of the powerful priestly establishments that had dominated Egyptian spiritual life for centuries. The practical implementation of these revolutionary ideas required careful planning and strategic thinking. Amenhotep IV understood that direct confrontation with established religious authorities would likely provoke resistance that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Instead, he began to introduce changes gradually, testing the limits of what traditional institutions would tolerate while building support among those who might benefit from religious reform. His first major public statement of theological innovation came in the 5th year of his reign, when he announced the construction of a new temple complex dedicated exclusively to the Aten. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples, which were typically dark, mysterious structures designed to emphasize the hidden nature of divine power, this new sanctuary would be open to the sky, allowing natural sunlight to illuminate the sacred spaces where worship would occur. The architectural plans for this temple represented a complete departure from centuries of Egyptian religious building traditions. Instead of the massive stone walls and small, shadowy chambers that characterized existing temples, the new structure would feature open courtyards, soaring pillars, and broad windows designed to maximize the penetration of natural light. The overall effect would be to create a sacred space where worshippers could experience direct communion with the Aten's life-giving rays. The announcement of this construction project sent shockwaves through Egypt's religious establishment. The priests of Amun-Ra, whose temple at Karnak was the wealthiest and most powerful religious institution in the kingdom, recognized immediately that the new theology posed an existential threat to their authority and influence. If the pharaoh succeeded in establishing the Aten as the supreme deity, the complex pantheon that supported their elaborate bureaucracy would become irrelevant. Initial resistance to the pharaoh's innovations took the form of subtle opposition rather than direct confrontation. Priests began to emphasize the ancient traditions and time-tested wisdom that had guided Egypt through centuries of prosperity and success. They reminded courtiers and common people alike that the existing religious system had divine sanction, having been established by the gods themselves and maintained by countless generations of faithful servants. But Amenhotep IV was prepared for this resistance, having anticipated that entrenched interests would oppose changes that threatened their power and privilege. He began to systematically replace hostile priests with individuals who were more sympathetic to his theological vision, using his authority as pharaoh to reshape the religious hierarchy according to his revolutionary principles. These personnel changes were implemented gradually to avoid creating unnecessary controversy, but their cumulative effect was to weaken traditional opposition while strengthening support for Atenist theology. The transformation accelerating throughout the kingdom would soon reach a point of no return, as the pharaoh prepared to take the most radical step of his reign. The time was approaching when he would abandon not only the old gods, but even his own name, transforming himself from Amenhotep IV into Akhenaten, the living spirit of the Aten. With this change would come the establishment of an entirely new capital city, built from nothing in the desert, dedicated solely to the worship of the one true God who ruled the heavens and the earth through the power of the sun. The power of the sun. The morning sun cast its first golden rays across the virgin sands of Middle Egypt, as Akhenaten stood at the edge of what would become the greatest religious experiment in human history. The year was 1348 BCE, and the pharaoh who had once been called Amenhotep IV was about to embark on the most audacious project ever attempted by an Egyptian ruler. Here, on a crescent of desert bounded by limestone cliffs, on the east bank of the Nile, he would build an entirely new capital city dedicated solely to his revolutionary god. The site had been chosen with meticulous care after months of exploration along the Nile Valley. Royal surveyors had examined dozens of potential locations, but none had possessed the perfect combination of geographical features that Akhenaten sought for his holy city. This particular stretch of desert offered everything necessary for his vision: a broad plain suitable for large-scale construction, limestone cliffs that could provide building materials, and most importantly, a natural amphitheatre of rock formations that would focus the Aten's rays into the heart of the new settlement. As dawn broke over the construction site, thousands of workers began their daily labours under the watchful gaze of royal architects and engineers. The scene was unlike anything previously witnessed in Egyptian history. Where traditional cities had grown organically over centuries, accumulating layers of buildings and modifications according to practical necessity and available resources. Akhenaten's new capital was being created according to a unified master plan that reflected his theological vision. The city's layout followed principles that prioritized the worship of the Aten above all other considerations. The central axis ran from east to west, allowing the rising and setting sun to illuminate the most important ceremonial spaces at the beginning and end of each day. The great temple of the Aten occupied the heart of the urban design, its open courtyards and soaring pylons positioned to capture the maximum amount of natural light throughout the solar cycle. Construction workers began each day before sunrise, gathering in the pale pre-dawn light to receive their assignments from foremen who had spent the night reviewing architectural plans by lamplight. Unlike the massive stone blocks that characterized traditional Egyptian building projects, much of the new city was being constructed using a revolutionary technique that employed smaller, standardized blocks called talatat. These blocks could be carved and positioned much more quickly than traditional masonry, allowing the city to rise from the desert with unprecedented speed. The talatat blocks were perfectly suited to Akhenaten's architectural vision. Their relatively small size allowed for more flexible building designs that could incorporate the curved lines and organic forms that reflected the natural world. Traditional Egyptian architecture had emphasized geometric precision and mathematical perfection, but the new style emerging at Akhenaten's capital celebrated the flowing, dynamic qualities observed in living systems illuminated by sunlight. Skilled stonemasons worked throughout the morning hours, their bronze chisels ringing against limestone as they carved relief scenes that depicted the royal family worshipping under the Aten's protective rays. These artistic works represented a complete departure from traditional Egyptian sculptural conventions. Instead of the rigid, idealized figures that had adorned royal monuments for centuries, the new reliefs showed Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their children in relaxed, intimate poses that emphasized their humanity rather than their divine status. The sculptors working on these revolutionary artworks had been carefully selected from among Egypt's most talented craftsmen, but many struggled initially to adapt their skills to the new aesthetic requirements. Traditional training had emphasized precise adherence to mathematical proportions and conventional poses that had remained unchanged since the Old Kingdom. Now they were being asked to observe and represent the natural world directly, creating images that captured the spontaneous expressions and gestures of real people engaged in genuine emotional interactions. Master sculptors worked alongside their apprentices in open-air workshops that allowed natural light to illuminate their work throughout the day. They studied the way sunlight played across human faces, noting how different angles of illumination could emphasize various emotional qualities. A face lit from above might appear serene and contemplative, while side lighting could suggest dynamism and energy. These observations were incorporated into relief carvings that seemed to glow with inner vitality when struck by the sun's rays. The royal workshops produced an endless stream of architectural elements decorated with innovative artistic motifs. Column capitals were carved to resemble lotus blossoms and papyrus plants, their organic forms creating the impression that the stone buildings were somehow alive and growing. Wall surfaces featured intricate patterns inspired by the movement of water, the texture of tree bark, and the delicate structures of flower petals. Every decorative element reinforced the theological message that the Aten's creative power was manifest throughout the natural world. As the morning progressed toward noon, the construction site buzzed with activities that would have been impossible at traditional Egyptian building projects. Teams of workers moved with choreographed precision, their movements coordinated by a sophisticated communication system that used mirrors to flash signals across the vast construction area. This innovation allowed supervisors to direct operations over distances that would have required hours of travel using conventional methods. The royal palace complex was taking shape on a raised platform that commanded views across the entire city site. Unlike traditional pharaonic residences, which were typically enclosed within massive walls that emphasized royal isolation from common life, Akhenaten's palace was designed to be open and accessible. Large windows and broad terraces would allow the royal family to maintain visual contact with their subjects while conducting the daily business of governance. The palace architecture reflected the same theological principles that governed the city's overall design. Reception halls featured skylights that would bathe official ceremonies in natural illumination, while private apartments included gardens and courtyards where the royal family could experience direct communion with the Aten's life-giving rays. Every room was positioned to maximize solar penetration during specific times of day, creating spaces that would be transformed by changing patterns of light and shadow. Nefertiti spent her mornings moving between different construction areas, observing the progress of various projects, while offering suggestions that reflected her growing expertise in the new artistic style. Her presence at the construction site was unprecedented for an Egyptian queen, but her active participation in the city's development was essential to Akhenaten's vision of shared royal authority. Together, they represented a new model of divine kingship that emphasized partnership and collaboration rather than solitary masculine dominance. The queen's artistic sensibilities proved particularly valuable in developing decorative schemes for the palace's private apartments. She worked closely with painters and textile workers to create interior designs that would complement the revolutionary architecture while providing appropriate settings for intimate family life. Her chambers featured wall paintings that depicted the royal children playing in garden settings, their spontaneous gestures and expressions captured with a naturalism that would have been unthinkable in traditional royal art. The royal children themselves were frequent visitors to the construction site, their presence adding an element of domestic warmth to what might otherwise have been an austere religious project. Unlike previous Egyptian royal art, which typically showed princesses as miniature adults conforming to rigid conventional poses, the new artistic style captured them as real children engaged in typical childhood activities. Relief carvings showed them running and playing under the Aten's protective rays, their movements conveying the joy and spontaneity of youth. These images of royal family life served important theological purposes beyond their obvious emotional appeal. They demonstrated that the Aten's blessings extended to all aspects of human existence, from the most formal state ceremonies to the most intimate domestic moments. The god's life-giving power was manifest in children's laughter, in the tender gestures between husband and wife, and in the simple pleasure of sharing meals in sunlit courtyards. The afternoon hours brought different activities, as the intense heat of midday made heavy construction work dangerous for the labourers. During these periods, attention shifted to indoor projects that could be conducted in the shade of temporary shelters. Scribes worked on administrative documents that would govern the new city's operation once construction was complete. Their papyrus scrolls contained detailed plans for everything from water distribution systems to ceremonial protocols for the temple services. The scribal workshops represented another innovation in Akhenaten's revolutionary program. Traditional Egyptian writing had been dominated by complex religious and administrative formulas that remained virtually unchanged for centuries. The scribes working on the new city's documents were encouraged to develop simpler, more direct forms of expression that could be understood by ordinary people rather than just educated elites. This democratization of written communication reflected the broader theological principle that divine truth should be accessible to all believers, rather than hidden behind priestly mysteries. The Aten's message was understood to be fundamentally simple and universal, requiring no elaborate interpretation or specialized knowledge for proper comprehension. Sunlight fell equally on rich and poor, educated and illiterate, noble and commoner, demonstrating the divine commitment to equality and justice. The royal workshops also produced the first examples of a new literary genre that would become characteristic of Atenist culture. These were hymns and prayers addressed directly to the Aten, composed in language that emphasized personal relationship with the divine rather than formal ritual observance. The most famous of these compositions, later known as the Great Hymn to the Aten, captured the theological essence of Akhenaten's revolutionary vision in verses that celebrated the sun's role as creator and sustainer of all life. The hymn's opening lines established the fundamental principle of Atenist theology. How manifold it is, what thou hast made. They are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other. Thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou wert alone. All men, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth, going upon its feet, and what is on high, flying with its wings. These words represented more than poetic expression. They constituted a theological manifesto that challenged the fundamental assumptions of traditional Egyptian religion. By declaring the Aten to be the sole god, like whom there is no other, Akhenaten was explicitly rejecting the complex pantheon that had governed Egyptian spiritual life for over a millennium. The hymn's emphasis on the god's creative activity, whilst thou wert alone, denied the existence of other deities who might share in divine power or authority. The revolutionary implications of this theological position became clearer as the hymn continued. The world came into being by thy hand, according as thou hast made them. When thou hast risen, they live. When thou dost set, they die. Thou art lifetime, thy very self, for one lives only through thee. This passage established the Aten as not merely the supreme deity among many, but as the exclusive source of all existence and vitality. As evening approached the construction site, workers began to gather their tools and prepare for the day's end. But the transition from day to night held special significance in Atenist theology, representing the daily cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence. The setting sun was understood not as the departure of divine presence, but as a necessary period of rest that made possible the renewed vitality that would come with dawn's return. Akhenaten and Nefertiti often concluded their days by observing the sunset from elevated positions that commanded views across the construction site toward the western cliffs. These moments of contemplation allowed them to reflect on the progress of their revolutionary project, while experiencing direct communion with the divine force that they believed was guiding their efforts. The changing colors of the desert landscape, as it was transformed by the setting sun, provided daily confirmation of the Aten's creative power and artistic sensitivity. The royal couple's evening conversations during this period covered topics that ranged from practical construction concerns to profound theological speculation. They discussed architectural details that would enhance the city's spiritual atmosphere, while also considering the political implications of their religious revolution. The new capital would serve not only as a center of Atenist worship, but also as a demonstration of their commitment to the theological principles that were reshaping Egyptian civilization. As darkness fell over the construction site, the day's work was far from over. Teams of night workers continued essential projects by torchlight, their activities carefully planned to avoid interference with daytime operations. The constant activity reflected the urgent pace of construction driven by Akhenaten's determination to complete his holy city as quickly as possible. Every day of delay meant another day that Egypt remained bound to the old religious system that he believed was spiritually bankrupt and socially unjust. The night shifts also provided opportunities for more delicate work that required careful attention to detail. Skilled artisans used the steady illumination of oil lamps to create intricate decorative elements that would be installed in the temple and palace complexes. These nocturnal workshops produced some of the most exquisite examples of the new artistic style, their creators working with the focused intensity that darkness and silence seemed to encourage. The night workers included not only Egyptians, but also craftsmen from throughout the empire who had been attracted to the new capital by opportunities to participate in history's most ambitious religious experiment. Nubians skilled in goldworking contributed their expertise to the creation of ceremonial objects for temple use. Syrian carpenters brought knowledge of construction techniques that were adapted for use with the innovative talatat blocks. Mesopotamian specialists in bronze casting created the fittings and fixtures that would equip the new city's buildings. This international collaboration reflected another important aspect of Akhenaten's revolutionary vision. Traditional Egyptian religion had emphasized the unique superiority of Egyptian civilization and the inferior status of foreign peoples and their gods. But Atenist theology recognized the universal nature of the sun's life-giving power, which fell equally on all nations and peoples, regardless of their cultural backgrounds or political affiliations. The construction of the new capital thus became a practical demonstration of religious inclusivity that challenged traditional assumptions about Egyptian cultural supremacy. Workers from different regions labored side by side, their diverse skills and perspectives contributing to a project that transcended national boundaries and ethnic distinctions. The city rising from the desert sands would be a truly cosmopolitan center that reflected the universal appeal of Atenist theology. As the night progressed toward dawn, preparations began for another day of intensive construction activity. Supervisors reviewed the previous day's accomplishments while planning the next phase of work on various projects throughout the site. The complexity of coordinating so many simultaneous activities required administrative skills that pushed the limits of Egyptian organizational capabilities. But the challenges were met with innovations that would influence construction management for generations to come. The approaching sunrise brought renewed energy and determination to everyone involved in the great project. Each new day represented another step toward the completion of humanity's first monotheistic capital, a city that would serve as the earthly center of a religious revolution destined to transform not only Egypt, but the entire ancient world. The sun's first rays illuminating the construction site seemed to promise divine approval for the unprecedented experiment in theological innovation and urban planning that was taking shape in the desert. The limestone cliffs caught the first light of dawn as Akhenaten emerged from his private chambers in the partially completed royal palace. The air was crisp and still, carrying the scent of fresh mortar and the distant sound of workers preparing for another day of construction. This was the 6th year since he had changed his name from Amenhotep IV, and the new capital was finally beginning to resemble the vision that had consumed his thoughts for so long. The pharaoh's morning routine had evolved considerably since establishing his residence in the desert city. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies that had marked royal awakenings in Thebes, his days now began with simple personal communion with the rising sun. He walked barefoot onto the eastern terrace of his apartment, feeling the cool stone beneath his feet as the first rays of the Aten touched his face. These moments of solitary contemplation had become essential to his spiritual practice, providing the inner strength necessary to guide Egypt through its unprecedented transformation. As the sun climbed higher above the horizon, the pharaoh could observe the vast construction site spreading out below his elevated residence. Thousands of workers were already moving through the grid of streets and building foundations, their activities coordinated with military precision, but infused with a sense of purpose that went far beyond typical construction projects. These men and women weren't simply building another royal city, they were creating the physical manifestation of a new relationship between humanity and divinity. The sound of chanting drifted up from the great temple complex, where the morning service was beginning in the open-air courtyards. Unlike the mysterious hidden rituals that characterized traditional Egyptian temple worship, Atenist ceremonies were conducted under the open sky, where all could witness the direct connection between earthly devotion and celestial blessing. The voices of priests and worshippers rose together in hymns that celebrated the Aten's daily resurrection and its promise of renewed life for all creation. Akhenaten descended from his private terrace to join the public worship, walking through corridors lined with relief carvings that depicted his family receiving the Aten's life-giving rays. These images served as constant reminders of the theological revolution he had initiated, but they also reflected the personal cost of his religious innovations. Traditional pharaonic art had emphasized the ruler's eternal, unchanging nature, but the new style revealed him as a mortal man, dependent on divine grace for his authority and effectiveness. The temple courtyard was already filled with worshippers from every level of Egyptian society when the royal family arrived for morning prayers. Nobles and commoners stood side by side in the democratic equality that Atenist theology demanded, their upturned faces reflecting the golden light that streamed down from the solar disk overhead. This scene would have been impossible in traditional Egyptian temples, where rigid social hierarchies determined every aspect of religious participation. Nefertiti joined her husband at the altar that occupied the center of the courtyard, her presence beside him symbolizing the partnership that had become central to their revolutionary reign. She carried their youngest daughter, whose innocent laughter seemed to embody the joy and spontaneity that Atenist worship was meant to inspire. The older princesses followed behind, their movements graceful and unrestrained by the formal protocols that had governed royal behavior for centuries. The morning service began with the great hymn to the Aten, its verses flowing like music as hundreds of voices joined in unison. The words spoke of creation and renewal, of the sun's power to awaken sleeping flowers and fill human hearts with gladness. But beneath the celebratory language lay deeper theological truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity and its relationship to earthly existence. As the hymn reached its climax, priests carrying golden censers moved through the congregation, spreading clouds of frankincense that sparkled in the morning sunlight. The smoke rose toward the sky in spirals that seemed to carry the prayers of the faithful directly to the Aten's presence, creating a visual symbol of the communication between earth and heaven that was central to the new religious system. The service concluded with the distribution of bread and fruit that had been blessed by exposure to the sun's rays during the ceremony. This communion meal reinforced the theological principle that the Aten's life-giving power was transmitted through all natural substances that received solar illumination. Eating food that had been touched by divine light was understood to be a form of spiritual nourishment that complemented physical sustenance. Following the morning worship, Akhenaten made his way to the administrative complex, where the daily business of governing the empire awaited his attention. The offices and audience chambers had been designed according to the same principles that governed the temple architecture, with large windows and open courtyards that allowed natural light to illuminate official proceedings. This transparency was both practical and symbolic, representing the pharaoh's commitment to conducting government business under the Aten's watchful presence. The first audience of the day involved provincial governors who had traveled from distant regions to report on conditions in their territories. Their accounts revealed the mixed reception that Atenist reforms were receiving throughout the empire. Some communities had embraced the new theology with enthusiasm, finding in its simplified message a spiritual authenticity that traditional religion had failed to provide. Others remained deeply attached to ancient practices and viewed the changes with suspicion or outright hostility. One governor from a southern province reported that several traditional temples had voluntarily converted their facilities for Atenist worship, their priests recognizing the theological superiority of monotheistic belief. Another official described resistance from conservative communities, where elderly citizens refused to abandon gods their families had worshipped for generations. These conflicting reports illustrated the enormous challenge of transforming religious consciousness across such a vast and diverse population. Akhenaten listened to each report with careful attention, asking detailed questions that revealed his sophisticated understanding of the political and social dynamics involved in religious change. He recognized that successful transformation would require patience and persuasion rather than coercion, but he also understood that some degree of resistance was inevitable when fundamental beliefs were challenged. The key was to maintain momentum toward reform while avoiding confrontations that might destabilize the entire kingdom. The morning audiences also included foreign ambassadors who brought news from Egypt's vassal kingdoms and trading partners throughout the ancient world. These diplomatic reports revealed that Egypt's religious revolution was being watched with intense interest by rulers and priests in distant lands. Some foreign courts expressed curiosity about Atenist theology and its potential applications to their own religious systems. Others worried that Egyptian innovations might inspire dangerous changes in their own territories. A Mesopotamian envoy described discussions among Babylonian scholars about the relationship between Atenist monotheism and similar theological developments in their region. Syrian diplomats reported that several city-states were experimenting with solar worship that bore striking similarities to Egyptian practices. These international connections suggested that Akhenaten's religious revolution might have implications far beyond the borders of his own kingdom. The pharaoh's responses to these diplomatic reports reflected his growing confidence in the universal appeal of Atenist theology. He spoke of the Aten's light falling equally on all nations and peoples, suggesting that divine truth transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. This theological inclusivity represented a radical departure from traditional Egyptian beliefs about their unique relationship with the gods and their superior status among the nations of the world. As the formal audiences concluded, Akhenaten moved to his private study where he could focus on the intellectual work that occupied much of his time during the middle hours of each day. The room was filled with papyrus scrolls containing theological treatises, architectural plans, and correspondence with scholars throughout the empire who were contributing to the development of Atenist doctrine and practice. The pharaoh's scholarly activities during this period were remarkably diverse, ranging from detailed theological speculation to practical questions about temple administration and ritual procedures. He corresponded with astronomers who were developing new methods for calculating the sun's movements across the sky throughout the year. He consulted with architects about innovations in building design that would maximize natural illumination in sacred spaces. He worked with poets and musicians to create new forms of artistic expression that would communicate Atenist theology to illiterate populations. One project that particularly absorbed his attention was the development of a comprehensive legal code based on Atenist principles of justice and equality. Traditional Egyptian law had been a complex accumulation of precedents and royal decrees that often reflected the interests of powerful elites rather than universal moral principles. The new legal system being developed in the capital would emphasize the equal dignity of all people under the Aten's protective care, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. The legal reforms being drafted in the pharaoh's study would have revolutionary implications for Egyptian society. Provisions for equal treatment of men and women in commercial transactions challenged patriarchal assumptions that had governed business relationships for centuries. Regulations protecting the rights of foreign workers reflected the theological principle that the Aten's care extended to all peoples, regardless of their national origins. Limitations on the exploitation of agricultural laborers demonstrated concern for the welfare of common people, whose productivity supported the entire economic system. These legal innovations required careful coordination with provincial administrators, who would be responsible for implementing new procedures throughout the empire. Akhenaten maintained extensive correspondence with governors and judges, providing them with detailed explanations of the theological principles underlying each reform, while also addressing practical questions about enforcement and compliance. This educational process was essential for ensuring that legal changes reflected genuine spiritual transformation rather than mere administrative adjustment. The afternoon hours brought a different rhythm to the pharaoh's daily schedule, as the intense heat made outdoor activities uncomfortable for everyone except the most dedicated construction workers. During these periods, Akhenaten often retreated to shaded courtyards, where he could continue his work while remaining in contact with the natural world that was so central to Atenist spirituality. These quiet afternoon sessions frequently involved collaboration with Nefertiti, whose intellectual contributions had become increasingly important to the development of theological and artistic innovations. The royal couple would spend hours discussing complex philosophical questions about the nature of divine truth and its implications for human behavior. Their conversations ranged from abstract speculation about cosmic order to practical concerns about implementing religious reforms in ways that would benefit ordinary Egyptians. The Queen's perspective on these matters was particularly valuable because of her sensitivity to the concerns of women and children, who were often overlooked in traditional discussions of religious and political policy. She advocated for reforms that would improve educational opportunities for girls, arguing that the Atenist principle of universal divine care required equal development of human potential regardless of gender. She also promoted changes in marriage and family law that would provide better protection for wives and mothers while maintaining appropriate respect for traditional values. These collaborative sessions between the royal couple often produced insights that neither could have achieved working alone. Akhenaten's systematic theological approach, combined with Nefertiti's intuitive understanding of human nature, to create a comprehensive vision of reformed society that was both spiritually authentic and practically achievable. Their partnership demonstrated the Atenist principle that divine truth was revealed through relationship and cooperation, rather than individual revelation or institutional authority. The royal children were frequent participants in these afternoon discussions, their presence adding elements of spontaneity and wonder that enriched the theological exploration. Unlike traditional royal education, which emphasized formal instruction in classical texts and established protocols, the princesses were encouraged to ask questions and express opinions about the religious and political changes occurring around them. Their innocent perspectives often revealed assumptions and contradictions that adult participants had overlooked. One particularly memorable afternoon session involved a discussion of artistic representation that arose when the youngest princess asked why the new paintings of the royal family looked different from older images she had seen in traditional temples. This question prompted an extended exploration of the relationship between artistic truth and theological authenticity that resulted in new guidelines for court artists and sculptors. The conversation revealed that traditional Egyptian art had prioritized symbolic meaning over naturalistic representation, creating images that communicated theological truths through conventional visual formulas rather than direct observation of the natural world. The new Atenist aesthetic sought to honor divine creation by representing it honestly and accurately, believing that authentic depiction of natural beauty was more spiritually meaningful than adherence to artificial conventions. This artistic philosophy had implications that extended far beyond questions of style and technique. By encouraging artists to observe and represent the world directly, Atenist culture was promoting a more empirical approach to understanding reality that challenged traditional reliance on inherited authority and conventional wisdom. The emphasis on direct observation and honest representation reflected the broader theological principle that divine truth was accessible through immediate experience rather than priestly interpretation. As evening approached, the royal family would often gather in the palace gardens to observe the changing patterns of light and shadow that mark the sun's daily journey across the sky. These moments of shared contemplation had become essential elements of their spiritual practice, providing opportunities for quiet reflection on the day's activities and preparation for the night's rest. The garden setting was particularly conducive to theological meditation because it demonstrated the Aten's creative power in the most immediate and tangible way possible. The growth of plants, the activities of birds and insects, the interplay of light and shadow among the leaves, all provided concrete evidence of the divine force that sustained all existence. These natural phenomena served as a living theological text that could be read and interpreted by anyone willing to observe carefully and think deeply. The royal children's responses to these evening garden sessions revealed their growing understanding of Atenist theology through direct experience rather than formal instruction. They learned to recognize the patterns of plant growth that followed the sun's movement, to appreciate the beauty of light filtering through leaves and flowers, and to find spiritual significance in the simple pleasure of feeling warm sunlight on their skin. These childhood experiences of theological truth through natural observation were intended to create a generation that would understand Atenist principles intuitively rather than having to learn them as abstract doctrines. The royal daughters were being prepared to carry forward their parents' religious revolution by making it a natural part of their consciousness rather than an imposed system of belief. As darkness fell over the new capital, the royal family's day would conclude with evening prayers that thanked the Aten for the day's blessings while requesting protection during the hours of night when divine presence was less immediately apparent. These prayers acknowledged the cyclical nature of existence while affirming confidence in the sun's promised return with the dawn. The transition from day to night held special significance in Atenist theology, representing the temporary withdrawal of divine energy that made rest and renewal possible. Unlike traditional Egyptian beliefs that viewed darkness as a time of danger when evil forces threatened the world's stability, Atenist teaching understood night as a necessary part of the cosmic rhythm that enabled the continuous renewal of life and energy. The royal bedchambers had been designed to capture the first rays of morning sunlight, ensuring that each day would begin with immediate awareness of the Aten's renewed presence. This architectural feature reflected the theological principle that divine truth was most clearly revealed at moments of transition, when the eternal patterns of existence became visible to human consciousness. As Akhenaten prepared for sleep in his revolutionary capital, he could reflect with satisfaction on another day of progress toward the complete transformation of Egyptian civilization. The physical construction of the city was advancing rapidly, but more importantly, the spiritual and cultural changes that the new capital represented were beginning to take root throughout the kingdom. Each day brought new evidence that his theological vision was capable of inspiring genuine transformation in the lives of ordinary people. But the pharaoh also understood that his revolution was still far from complete, and that powerful forces throughout the empire remained committed to preserving the traditional system that his reforms threatened to overthrow. The coming years would test whether Atenist theology possessed the spiritual power and practical effectiveness necessary to sustain itself against the inevitable resistance of entrenched interests. The challenges ahead would require all the wisdom, courage, and divine guidance that he and his family could summon in service of the revolutionary truth that had transformed their understanding of existence itself. The gentle breeze carried whispers of discontent across the royal gardens, as Akhenaten's 7th year began, with omens that even his most devoted followers could not ignore. The morning ritual of sun worship continued unchanged, but beneath the surface of religious devotion, cracks were beginning to show in the foundation of his revolutionary kingdom. The first sign of trouble came from the provincial reports that arrived with the dawn courier. A papyrus scroll bearing the seal of the northern governor contained news that made the pharaoh pause in his morning contemplation. Several temples in the Delta region had experienced mysterious fires during the night, their causes unknown but their timing suspiciously coordinated. The burned structures had all been recently converted from traditional worship to Atenist ceremonies, suggesting that opposition to the religious revolution was taking increasingly violent forms. Akhenaten's response to this disturbing news revealed both his determination and his growing isolation from the practical realities of governing a vast empire. Rather than dispatching military forces to investigate the temple fires, he called for additional priests to be sent north to establish new centers of Atenist worship. His solution to resistance was to intensify the very changes that were provoking opposition, a strategy that demonstrated either supreme confidence in his theological vision or dangerous disconnection from political reality. The morning audience chamber witnessed scenes that would have been unthinkable during the early years of the reign. Foreign ambassadors who had once prostrated themselves with elaborate reverence now displayed subtle signs of disrespect in their ceremonial gestures. A Nubian envoy's bow was noticeably shallow, while a Syrian diplomat's tribute presentation lacked the ornate verbal formulas that traditionally demonstrated submission to Egyptian authority. These diplomatic slights reflected a broader shift in international perceptions of Egyptian power and stability. Foreign courts that had once feared Egyptian military might were beginning to test the limits of what they could achieve through defiance or neglect of their tributary obligations. Trade relationships that had enriched Egypt for generations were showing signs of strain as commercial partners sought alternative arrangements that might prove more reliable than dealings with a kingdom undergoing radical internal transformation. The pharaoh's responses to these diplomatic challenges revealed his growing tendency to interpret political problems through theological frameworks that may have obscured practical solutions. When the Mesopotamian ambassador presented a tribute that was significantly smaller than previous years, Akhenaten spoke at length about the Aten's universal love for all peoples, suggesting that reduced tribute payments might actually demonstrate spiritual progress toward equality and brotherhood among nations. This theological interpretation of what was clearly a political challenge left many court observers deeply concerned about the pharaoh's grasp of international realities. Traditional Egyptian diplomacy had relied on a careful balance of military intimidation and economic incentives to maintain tributary relationships that supported the empire's prosperity. Akhenaten's inclusive, pacifist approach to foreign relations was admirable from a moral perspective, but it seemed to be encouraging the very challenges to Egyptian authority that had historically been prevented through displays of strength and resolve. The administrative sessions that followed the diplomatic audiences revealed additional problems that were developing throughout the kingdom's internal governance systems. Provincial tax collections were falling short of projected revenues, partly due to economic disruption caused by the religious transformation, but also because of growing resistance to policies that seemed to favor the new capital at the expense of traditional regional centers. Memphis, the ancient capital that had governed Egypt for over 1,000 years, was experiencing particular difficulties as resources and personnel were diverted to support Akhenaten's desert city. The great administrative complex that had coordinated the empire's vast bureaucracy was struggling to function effectively with reduced staff and diminished authority. Many experienced officials had requested transfers to the new capital, but others had simply resigned their positions rather than participate in what they viewed as the abandonment of Egypt's historic greatness. Thebes, the religious center that had been the power base of the Amun priesthood, was facing even more severe challenges as its temples were systematically stripped of resources and authority. The massive complex at Karnak, once the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world, had been reduced to a shadow of its former magnificence. The priests who remained were struggling to maintain basic operations, while their colleagues either fled to remote provinces or reluctantly converted to Atenist theology. The human cost of these religious and administrative changes was becoming increasingly apparent in reports from throughout the kingdom. Families that had served the traditional temples for generations found themselves without employment or purpose as their ancestral roles disappeared. Artisans whose skills had been devoted to creating traditional religious art discovered that their expertise was no longer valued in the new aesthetic system. Entire communities that had grown up around major temple complexes faced economic collapse as the institutions that had supported them for centuries were abandoned or transformed. Akhenaten's response to these social disruptions demonstrated both his genuine compassion for human suffering and his inability to fully comprehend the magnitude of the changes he had initiated. He established relief programs to provide food and shelter for displaced temple workers, but he seemed to believe that these temporary measures would be sufficient to ease the transition to a new social order. His theological confidence that the Aten's truth would ultimately benefit all people prevented him from recognizing that some of the damage being done to traditional communities might be irreversible. The afternoon hours brought the pharaoh face to face with the most painful aspect of his revolutionary program: the growing alienation of his own family members from the changes he had implemented. His mother, Queen Tia, had arrived from Thebes for what she described as a state visit, but her true purpose was to confront her son about the destructive consequences of his religious policies. The conversation between mother and son took place in a garden pavilion where the afternoon sun created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex emotions surrounding their discussion. Queen Tai had been a formidable political force during her husband's reign, and her diplomatic skills had helped maintain the stability and prosperity that Akhenaten was now jeopardizing through his theological innovations. Her arguments were practical rather than religious, focusing on the measurable decline in Egypt's international standing and internal cohesion that had accompanied the Atenist revolution. She presented detailed reports from loyal officials throughout the kingdom who were witnessing the deterioration of administrative efficiency and social harmony. Her evidence was compelling, but her son's responses revealed how completely his worldview had been transformed by his spiritual convictions. Akhenaten listened respectfully to his mother's concerns, but his replies consistently returned to theological principles that seemed disconnected from the practical problems she was describing. He spoke of the Aten's eternal truth as if it were a solution to immediate political challenges, and he interpreted opposition to his reforms as evidence of spiritual blindness rather than legitimate disagreement with specific policies. The generational divide revealed in this conversation reflected a broader cultural transformation that was occurring throughout Egyptian society. Older Egyptians who had lived through the glorious achievements of previous reigns found it difficult to understand why proven systems and beliefs should be abandoned in favor of untested innovations. Younger people who had grown up during Akhenaten's reign were more receptive to change, but they lacked the experience and wisdom that might have helped them recognize potential problems before they became serious threats. Queen Ti's visit concluded without resolution of the fundamental disagreements between mother and son, but it marked a turning point in the royal family's relationship with the pharaoh's revolutionary program. Her departure from the capital was accompanied by several courtiers who had previously supported Akhenaten's reforms but were now having second thoughts about their ultimate consequences. The evening hours brought additional evidence of the growing crisis facing the kingdom when military dispatches arrived from the northern frontiers, reporting increased aggressive activity by foreign powers who seemed to be testing Egyptian resolve and capability. Hittite forces were probing the boundaries of Egyptian influence in Syria, while various tribal groups were launching raids against Egyptian installations along the trade routes that connected the Nile Valley to the broader Mediterranean world. These military challenges required immediate attention and decisive response, but Akhenaten's approach to defense planning revealed the same theological preoccupations that were affecting his handling of domestic and diplomatic problems. Rather than focusing on practical questions of troop deployment and strategic planning, he spent considerable time discussing how military activities could be conducted in accordance with Atenist principles of compassion and universal brotherhood. The pharaoh's military advisors found themselves in the impossible position of trying to plan defensive campaigns while adhering to religious principles that seemed to prohibit the aggressive actions necessary for effective deterrence. Traditional Egyptian military doctrine had emphasized overwhelming force and psychological intimidation as means of preventing conflicts before they could develop into serious threats. Akhenaten's pacifist inclinations were making it difficult to implement these proven strategies. The disconnect between theological idealism and military necessity was becoming particularly apparent in discussions of how to respond to attacks on Egyptian commercial interests. Merchants who had been robbed or murdered by raiders expected their government to retaliate in ways that would deter future attacks. But Akhenaten's advisors were struggling to develop responses that would satisfy these legitimate expectations while conforming to religious principles that emphasize forgiveness and understanding rather than punishment and revenge. As night fell over the capital city, the sounds of construction that had dominated the soundscape for years were noticeably diminished. Many of the major building projects were nearing completion, but the reduced activity also reflected growing difficulties in obtaining materials and labor for continued expansion. The limestone quarries that had provided building stone were showing signs of depletion, while skilled workers were increasingly reluctant to commit to long-term projects in a city whose future seemed uncertain. The economic challenges facing the capital were symptomatic of broader problems affecting the entire kingdom as traditional trade relationships and resource allocation systems struggled to adapt to the new priorities established by Atenist policies. The vast wealth that had supported Egypt's greatness for centuries was being redirected toward projects and purposes that many citizens viewed as wasteful or inappropriate, creating resentment and resistance that threatened the stability of the entire social system. Akhenaten's evening prayers in the palace chapel took on an increasingly desperate quality as he sought divine guidance for problems that seemed to be multiplying faster than solutions could be developed. His theological confidence remained unshaken, but even his closest associates could see signs of strain in his physical appearance and emotional demeanor. The weight of governing an empire, while simultaneously transforming its fundamental beliefs, was taking a visible toll on the revolutionary pharaoh. The royal family's evening meal was a subdued affair compared to the celebratory gatherings that had characterized the early years of their reign in the new capital. Several of the older princesses seemed withdrawn and thoughtful, as if they were beginning to understand the magnitude of the challenges facing their father's kingdom. Nefertiti maintained her supportive presence beside her husband, but careful observers noted subtle changes in her expressions that suggested growing concern about the direction of events. The Queen's private conversations with trusted advisors revealed her increasing awareness of the practical problems that were developing throughout the kingdom, but also her determination to support her husband's vision despite the mounting evidence of its political costs. Her loyalty to Akhenaten was both personal and theological, based on genuine belief in the truth of Atena's teachings as well as marital devotion, but she was also beginning to consider whether modifications to their revolutionary program might be necessary to preserve its essential achievements. As the royal couple retired to their private chambers, they could see from their windows the lights of the city spreading out below them in the darkness. The new capital was undeniably magnificent, a testament to human creativity and divine inspiration that would be remembered for millennia to come. But the very beauty of their achievement made the growing threats to its survival all the more poignant and tragic. The pharaoh's bedtime routine included private meditation on the day's events and preparation for the challenges that would come with tomorrow's sunrise. His prayers increasingly focused on requests for wisdom and strength rather than thanksgiving for divine blessings, reflecting his growing awareness that the Atenist revolution was entering its most dangerous phase. The transformation of Egypt that had begun with such confidence and enthusiasm was now facing tests that would determine whether theological truth could overcome political reality, whether spiritual vision could sustain practical governance, and whether a single man's revolutionary faith could reshape the consciousness of an entire civilization. The night sky above the capital city was filled with stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless kingdoms throughout history. As Akhenaten drifted towards sleep, he could not know that his own revolutionary experiment was already beginning its inevitable decline, or that the forces gathering against his theological vision would soon overwhelm even his most determined efforts to preserve the changes he had fought so hard to achieve. The morning sun that would rise over the capital tomorrow would illuminate a kingdom increasingly divided against itself, where the promise of spiritual renewal was being tested against the harsh realities of political survival and the stubborn resistance of human nature to radical change. The morning of Akhenaten's 8th year dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down upon the royal city like a heavy shroud. The pharaoh emerged from his chambers to find that the usual sounds of bustling activity had been replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that spoke of deeper troubles brewing throughout his revolutionary kingdom. The construction crews that had worked with such enthusiasm during the city's early years now moved with the mechanical precision of men who were completing tasks out of duty rather than passion. The limestone blocks that had once risen swiftly into magnificent temples and palaces were now being quarried with increasing difficulty, as the best stone had already been extracted from the nearby cliffs. Workers who had once competed for the honor of serving the pharaoh's grand vision were now more concerned with securing their wages before the project's inevitable completion left them without employment. Akhenaten's morning ritual of solar worship proceeded with its usual solemnity, But even this most sacred aspect of his daily routine was showing signs of strain. The priests who led the dawn ceremonies were fewer in number than they had been in previous years, as many had requested transfers to remote provinces where traditional religious practices were still tolerated. Those who remained displayed the kind of mechanical devotion that suggested professional obligation rather than genuine spiritual fervor. The great hymn to the Aten still echoed across the temple courtyards each morning, but its verses seemed to carry less conviction than they had during the early years of religious revolution. The voices that joined in the sacred chorus were noticeably fewer, and many of the worshippers who gathered in the open-air sanctuaries appeared more concerned with fulfilling social expectations than with experiencing genuine communion with divine truth. The pharaoh's breakfast was served on the eastern terrace of his palace, where he could observe the sun's rays gradually illuminating the city that represented his greatest achievement. But even this daily pleasure was tinged with melancholy as he noticed the empty construction sites and abandoned building projects that dotted the urban landscape. The grand vision that had once seemed destined to transform human civilization was beginning to show signs of incompletion and decay. Nefertiti joined her husband for the morning meal, but their conversation lacked the intellectual excitement that had characterized their early years in the capital. The Queen's attention was increasingly focused on practical concerns about their daughter's education and future marriages, topics that reflected her growing awareness that the royal family's long-term security could no longer be taken for granted. The royal children who appeared for breakfast displayed the restless energy of young people who were beginning to understand that their world was not as stable as they had been led to believe. The older princesses asked increasingly pointed questions about their father's policies and their implications for Egypt's relationship with foreign powers. Their innocent inquiries revealed a sophistication that troubled their parents, suggesting that even the younger generation was beginning to question the wisdom of the revolutionary path their family had chosen. The morning's administrative sessions brought a steady stream of reports that painted an increasingly dire picture of conditions throughout the kingdom. Provincial governors described widespread unrest in regions where traditional temples had been closed or converted to Atenist worship. Tax collectors reported growing resistance to revenue demands that were perceived as funding the pharaoh's personal religious obsessions, rather than serving legitimate governmental purposes. Military commanders presented intelligence reports indicating that Egypt's enemies were becoming increasingly bold in their challenges to imperial authority. The Hittites had launched successful raids against Egyptian outposts in Syria, capturing valuable territory that had been under pharaonic control for generations. Nubian tribes were testing the southern borders with unprecedented aggression, apparently believing that Egypt's military capabilities had been weakened by internal religious conflicts. The pharaoh's responses to these military challenges revealed the extent to which his theological preoccupations had compromised his ability to function as an effective war leader. Rather than ordering immediate retaliation against foreign aggressors, he called for diplomatic missions that would attempt to convert enemy rulers to Atenist beliefs. His conviction that theological truth would ultimately triumph over military force was touching in its sincerity, but it was proving inadequate for defending an empire under increasing pressure from multiple directions. The foreign ambassadors who attended the morning audiences were noticeably less deferential than they had been during the early years of Akhenaten's reign. Representatives from vassal kingdoms presented their tribute with perfunctory gestures that barely concealed their growing contempt for Egyptian weakness. Diplomatic correspondence from major powers contained language that would have been considered insulting during previous reigns, but the pharaoh seemed unable to recognize these subtle challenges to his authority. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when the Mesopotamian ambassador presented a treaty proposal that would have reduced Egypt to junior partner status in a regional alliance dominated by Babylonian interests. The document's terms were so disadvantageous that they amounted to a diplomatic insult, but Akhenaten's response focused on the opportunities for religious dialogue that the proposed alliance might create, rather than on its political implications for Egyptian sovereignty, the afternoon hours brought the pharaoh face to face with perhaps the most devastating challenge to his revolutionary program: the growing alienation of his own military commanders from the policies they were expected to implement. General Horemheb, who had served the royal family with distinction for decades, requested a private audience that would fundamentally alter the political dynamics surrounding the throne. The conversation between pharaoh and general took place in a private chamber, where afternoon sunlight created an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility that contrasted sharply with the gravity of the topics under discussion. Horemheb's concerns were practical and immediate, focusing on the military consequences of religious policies that were undermining Egypt's ability to defend itself against foreign aggression. The general presented detailed reports from frontier commanders who were struggling to maintain morale among troops who no longer understood what they were fighting to preserve. Soldiers who had once taken pride in serving the world's greatest empire were beginning to question whether their sacrifices were worthwhile when their leaders seemed more concerned with theological speculation than with practical defense of Egyptian interests. Horemheb's arguments were supported by concrete evidence of military deterioration that even Akhenaten could not dismiss as spiritual blindness or temporary adjustment difficulties. Equipment shortages were affecting combat readiness, as resources were diverted to construction projects in the royal capital. Training programs had been disrupted by religious reforms that required soldiers to participate in Atenas ceremonies rather than focusing on military skills. Most seriously, recruitment was declining as young men throughout the kingdom chose civilian occupations rather than military service that seemed to offer little prospect of glory or advancement. The pharaoh's response to these military concerns revealed both his genuine patriotism and his inability to separate political realities from theological convictions. He acknowledged the seriousness of the challenges facing Egyptian defense, but he continued to believe that spiritual transformation would ultimately provide solutions to practical problems. His suggestion that military effectiveness could be improved through more intensive religious education struck the general as dangerously naive. The conversation concluded without resolution of the fundamental disagreements between royal idealism and military pragmatism, but it marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between Akhenaten's government and the professional military establishment that was essential for imperial survival. Horemheb's departure from the royal presence was accompanied by subtle gestures that suggested his loyalty to the throne was becoming conditional rather than absolute. The evening hours brought additional evidence of the kingdom's deteriorating condition when reports arrived describing civil disturbances in several major cities throughout Egypt. Memphis had experienced riots when authorities attempted to remove traditional religious statues from public buildings. Thebes was witnessing organized resistance to tax collectors who were attempting to enforce revenue assessments that local citizens considered excessive and illegitimate. These domestic challenges were particularly troubling because they indicated that opposition to Akhenaten's policies was moving beyond passive resistance toward active defiance of royal authority. The social contract that had bound Egyptian society together for centuries was beginning to unravel as citizens lost confidence in their government's ability to protect their interests and preserve their traditional way of life. The pharaoh's evening meal with his family was a somber affair that reflected the growing awareness that their revolutionary experiment was facing challenges that might prove insurmountable. The palace dining chamber, which had once echoed with animated discussions of theological innovation and artistic achievement, was now dominated by concerned conversations about practical problems and immediate dangers. Nefertiti's attempts to maintain a cheerful atmosphere for their daughters could not entirely mask her own growing anxiety about the future. The Queen's private discussions with trusted advisors had revealed the extent of the crisis facing the royal family, but she remained committed to supporting her husband's vision, even as evidence mounted that it might be leading to disaster. The royal children's bedtime routines had become increasingly elaborate as their parents attempted to preserve some semblance of normal family life, despite the mounting pressures surrounding the throne. The older princesses were old enough to understand that their father's policies were creating serious problems, but they were still too young to fully comprehend the implications for their own futures. As night fell over the capital city, Akhenaten found himself alone in his private study, surrounded by the papyrus scrolls and architectural plans that represented his life's work. The theological treatises that had once filled him with excitement now seemed inadequate for addressing the practical challenges that were overwhelming his kingdom. The building plans for temples and palaces appeared increasingly irrelevant in a world where survival itself was becoming uncertain. The pharaoh's evening prayers took on a desperate quality as he sought divine guidance for problems that seemed to be multiplying beyond his ability to comprehend or control. His faith in the Aten's ultimate truth remained unshaken, but he was beginning to understand that spiritual conviction alone might not be sufficient to preserve the revolutionary civilization he had attempted to create. The night sky above the royal capital was filled with the same stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless kingdoms throughout human history. As Akhenaten prepared for sleep in his magnificent but increasingly isolated palace, he could not know that the forces gathering against his theological revolution were already approaching the point where they would overwhelm even his most determined efforts to preserve the changes he had fought so hard to achieve. The morning sun that would rise tomorrow would illuminate a kingdom that was rapidly approaching the moment of decision between revolutionary idealism and practical survival, between theological truth and political reality, between the dreams of a visionary pharaoh and the harsh demands of governing an empire under siege from enemies, both foreign and domestic. The transformation that had begun with such promise and enthusiasm was now entering its final and most dangerous phase, where the ultimate test would determine whether human civilization could be reshaped by the spiritual vision of a single extraordinary individual, or whether the weight of tradition and the pressure of practical necessity would ultimately triumph over even the most sincere attempts at revolutionary change. The 9th year of Akhenaten's reign brought with it a silence that seemed to permeate every corner of his revolutionary capital. The pharaoh's morning awakening was no longer accompanied by the sounds of thousands of workers chiseling limestone, or the cheerful calls of artisans beginning another day of creation. Instead, an oppressive quiet hung over the city like morning mist, broken only by the distant barking of wild dogs that had begun to roam the abandoned construction sites. The royal bedchamber itself bore witness to the changes that had crept into the pharaoh's daily existence. Where once servants had bustled about with eager efficiency, now only a handful of attendants remained to perform the morning rituals. Their movements were careful and precise, but they lacked the enthusiastic devotion that had characterized service in the early years of the capital's existence. These men and women went about their duties with the mechanical competence of people fulfilling obligations rather than serving a cause they believed in. As Akhenaten rose from his bed and walked toward the eastern window to greet the dawn, his footsteps echoed in chambers that seemed larger and emptier than they had in previous years. The elaborate furniture and decorative objects that filled his private apartments appeared somehow diminished, as if the very air had grown thinner and less capable of supporting the weight of imperial grandeur. The morning sun cast its familiar golden rays across the pharaoh's face as he performed his daily communion with the Atan, but even this most sacred ritual felt different now. The warmth that had once seemed to flow directly from divine source to earthly recipient now felt more like ordinary sunshine, pleasant but lacking the transcendent quality that had once made each dawn feel like a personal revelation from the God he served. His breakfast was served on the terrace overlooking the city, but the view that greeted him each morning was increasingly dominated by signs of decline and abandonment. Construction cranes stood motionless against the sky, their wooden arms reaching toward heaven like the dried bones of some ancient creature. Scaffolding surrounded half-finished buildings that would never be completed, their limestone blocks weathering in the desert sun while waiting for workers who would never return. The streets below buzzed with activity, but it was the wrong kind of activity. instead of the purposeful movement of craftsmen and administrators building a new world. Akhenaten could observe the frantic scurrying of people preparing to leave. Wagons loaded with household possessions moved steadily toward the harbour, where boats waited to carry families back to the traditional cities they had abandoned years earlier in pursuit of the pharaoh's revolutionary dream. Nefertiti joined her husband for the morning meal, but their conversation had evolved from the exciting theological discussions of earlier years to careful negotiations about immediate practical concerns. The Queen's primary focus now was on securing the future of their daughters, a task that required delicate diplomatic maneuvering as potential marriage alliances became increasingly complicated by the political isolation that was settling around the royal family. The older princesses who appeared for breakfast displayed a maturity that seemed premature for their years. They spoke in careful, measured phrases that suggested they had learned to weigh their words before speaking, understanding instinctively that casual remarks could have consequences in a world where loyalty was becoming a precious and fragile commodity. The youngest child still retained some of the carefree spirit that had once characterized the entire royal household, but even her laughter seemed muted now, as if the oppressive atmosphere of the palace had begun to affect even the most innocent members of the family. Her games and spontaneous expressions of joy served as painful reminders of what the royal residence had once been like when hope and excitement had filled every corridor. The morning administrative sessions brought a steadily diminishing number of officials to the audience chamber. Many of the provincial governors who had once made regular pilgrimages to the capital were now sending junior representatives with perfunctory reports, while others had simply stopped communicating with the royal government altogether. The bureaucratic apparatus that had once coordinated the affairs of a vast empire was collapsing into isolated fragments as regional authorities began to govern independently of central direction. Foreign ambassadors who still bothered to visit the capital came with messages that barely concealed their contempt for Egyptian weakness. Trade agreements that had once favoured Egypt were being renegotiated on terms that reflected the kingdom's diminished bargaining position. Tribute payments from vassal states had dwindled to token amounts, while some former dependencies had simply declared their independence without bothering to inform the pharaoh officially. The reports from military commanders painted an increasingly desperate picture of Egypt's defensive capabilities. Garrison towns along the northern frontier were being abandoned as troops were recalled to defend more critical positions closer to the Nile Valley. The professional army that had once projected Egyptian power across 3 continents was shrinking into a defensive force, barely adequate to protect the kingdom's core territories. Akhenaten's responses to these challenges revealed how completely his worldview had been shaped by theological considerations that seemed increasingly disconnected from political realities. When presented with evidence of military defeats, he spoke of the spiritual lessons that adversity could teach. When informed about economic difficulties, he suggested that material prosperity was less important than spiritual enlightenment. His ability to reframe every practical problem as a theological opportunity was remarkable, but it was also becoming a source of frustration for advisors who needed concrete solutions to immediate crises. The afternoon hours found the pharaoh increasingly isolated in his private study, surrounded by the intellectual projects that had once energized him, but now seemed like futile gestures against an indifferent universe. The theological treatises he continued to write were read by fewer and fewer people, as scholars and priests departed the capital for more promising opportunities elsewhere. The architectural plans he refined with obsessive attention to detail would never be implemented, because the resources and manpower necessary for construction were no longer available. His correspondence with the few remaining supporters of Atenist theology took on an increasingly desperate tone as he tried to maintain enthusiasm for reforms that were clearly failing to achieve their intended objectives. Letters from provincial officials who had once embraced the new religion now contained subtle suggestions that modifications might be necessary to preserve what had been achieved. These diplomatic hints that his revolution was being abandoned, even by its most committed supporters, were perhaps more devastating than open opposition would have been. The royal workshops that had once produced magnificent examples of the new artistic style were now operating with skeleton crews of craftsmen who completed their assignments with competent skill, but without the inspired creativity that had characterized the early years of cultural revolution. The sculptures and reliefs they produced were technically proficient, but lacked the spiritual vitality that had made Atenist art seem like a genuine breakthrough in human artistic expression. Nefertiti's afternoon activities reflected her growing focus on practical preparations for an uncertain future. The Queen spent increasing amounts of time in private conferences with trusted advisors, reviewing financial arrangements and diplomatic options that might preserve some vestige of royal authority, regardless of what happened to her husband's theological experiment. Her loyalty to Akhenaten remained absolute, but her responsibilities as a mother required her to consider possibilities that his faith would not allow him to contemplate. The royal children's education continued under the guidance of tutors who struggled to maintain traditional academic standards while adhering to Atenist principles that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the practical skills the princesses would need in a world that was rejecting their father's innovations. The older girls displayed a sophisticated understanding of political realities that contrasted sharply with the idealistic optimism they had been taught to maintain in public. Evening meals in the royal dining chamber had become subdued affairs, where conversation focused on immediate concerns rather than the grand philosophical discussions that had once characterized family gatherings. The elaborate ceremonial protocols that had once made each meal feel like a sacred ritual were gradually being simplified as the household staff dwindled and the resources available for formal entertainment became increasingly limited. The palace gardens provided the royal family with their most reliable source of peace and comfort during these difficult times. The plants and flowers that had been carefully cultivated to demonstrate the Aten's life-giving power continued to bloom according to natural cycles that remained unaffected by human political failures. These living examples of divine creativity served as daily reminders that the theological truths underlying Akhenaten's revolution might be eternal, even if their political implementation was proving to be temporary. The pharaoh's evening walks through these gardens became extended meditations on the relationship between spiritual truth and worldly success. He could observe the way sunlight continued to nourish growing plants regardless of the human dramas playing out in the nearby palace, and these observations reinforced his conviction that divine reality transcended the temporary setbacks that were afflicting his earthly kingdom. But even these moments of natural tranquility were tinged with melancholy, as Akhenaten noticed signs of neglect that reflected the reduced maintenance staff available to care for the extensive landscaping. Weeds were beginning to appear in previously immaculate flower beds, while some of the more exotic plants were showing signs of stress from inadequate attention. The garden that had once symbolized the harmony between human cultivation and divine creativity was slowly returning to the desert from which it had been carved. As darkness fell over the capital, the pharaoh could observe from his palace windows the lights of a city that was already becoming a shadow of what it had been during its brief period of glory. Entire neighborhoods stood empty as their residents had departed for more promising opportunities elsewhere. The harbor that had once bustled with boats bringing supplies and visitors now served primarily as a departure point for families fleeing the uncertainty that surrounded the royal experiment. The evening prayers that concluded each day had evolved from expressions of thanksgiving and confidence into appeals for strength and guidance during increasingly difficult circumstances. Akhenaten's personal relationship with the Aten remained as intense as ever, but his prayers now focused more on requests for wisdom to understand divine purposes that seemed mysterious and sometimes painful than on celebrations of obvious blessings and clear guidance. The royal bedtime routine had been simplified, as many of the servants who had once participated in elaborate evening ceremonies had departed along with other palace staff members. The remaining attendants performed their duties with quiet efficiency, but the atmosphere of reverent celebration that had once surrounded the conclusion of each day had been replaced by a more somber sense of ritual obligation. As Akhenaten prepared for sleep, in his magnificent but increasingly empty palace, he was surrounded by the physical evidence of humanity's greatest attempt to reshape civilization according to divine truth. The walls around him were covered with artistic masterpieces that would be admired for millennia to come. The architectural innovations visible through his windows represented advances in building technology that would influence construction techniques throughout the ancient world. Yet the pharaoh understood with growing clarity that the political framework necessary to sustain these cultural achievements was crumbling despite his most determined efforts to preserve it. The kingdom that had once seemed destined to demonstrate the practical benefits of theological revolution was approaching a crisis that might sweep away everything he had worked to accomplish. The night sky above his capital was filled with stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human civilizations throughout history. As sleep gradually overcame the revolutionary pharaoh, he could not know that the forces gathering against his theological experiment had already reached the point where they would soon overwhelm even his most sincere efforts to preserve the changes he had fought so courageously to achieve. The dawn that would break tomorrow would illuminate a kingdom balanced on the edge of transformation, where the ultimate test was approaching that would determine whether the spiritual vision of one extraordinary individual could survive the relentless pressure of political reality and human nature's resistance to radical change. The 10th year of Akhenaten's reign arrived like a thief in the night, stealing away what remained of his revolutionary dream with each passing dawn. The pharaoh's awakening came not to the familiar sounds of a thriving capital, but to a silence so complete it seemed to press against his consciousness, like the weight of the tomb itself. The morning ritual that had once filled him with divine purpose now felt like an echo of something that had died without his noticing. As he stood on his eastern terrace, watching the sun emerge over the limestone cliffs, Akhenaten could see the skeletal remains of construction projects scattered across the desert, like the bones of some great beast that had perished in its sleep. The Talatat blocks that had once risen swiftly into magnificent temples now lay abandoned in neat piles, their surfaces already beginning to show the weathering that would eventually return them to the earth from which they had been carved. The royal breakfast was served by a single attendant, a young man whose grandfather had once supervised dozens of servants in these same chambers. The reduction in palace staff had happened so gradually that each day's diminishment seemed natural, until suddenly the pharaoh found himself living in rooms that echoed with the ghosts of vanished grandeur. The golden vessels that held his morning meal were the same ones that had graced royal tables since the capital's founding, but they seemed somehow tarnished now, their brilliance dimmed by the grey light of a kingdom in decline. Nefertiti's absence from the morning meal spoke volumes about the changes that had crept into their daily existence. The Queen now spent her mornings in urgent conferences with the few remaining court officials, desperately trying to negotiate arrangements that might preserve some vestige of their daughters' futures. Her conversations took place behind closed doors, in chambers far from the pharaoh's hearing, as if the very walls of the palace had learned to keep secrets from their royal occupant. The administrative sessions that followed breakfast revealed the extent to which the machinery of government had simply ceased to function. Provincial reports that had once arrived with reliable regularity now came sporadically, if at all. Many regions had apparently decided that communication with the capital was no longer worth the expense and effort, especially when royal responses consisted primarily of theological reflections rather than practical guidance or material support. The few foreign ambassadors who still maintained diplomatic relations with Egypt brought messages that barely concealed their awareness of the kingdom's weakness. A Nubian envoy presented tribute that amounted to little more than token recognition, while a Syrian representative delivered a trade proposal that would have been laughable in its audacity during the great days of Egyptian power. Yet, Akhenaten received these diplomatic insults with the same serene attention he had once devoted to genuine expressions of international respect. Military reports painted an even more disturbing picture of Egypt's deteriorating position in the ancient world. Garrison commanders described wholesale desertions as professional soldiers abandoned their posts to seek employment with foreign armies that could offer regular pay and clear strategic objectives. The frontier fortresses that had once projected Egyptian power deep into foreign territories were being evacuated one by one as the resources necessary to maintain them were diverted to defend the shrinking core of the pharaoh's remaining domain. General Horemheb's afternoon audience with the pharaoh carried the weight of final ultimatum, though both men were too civilized to acknowledge the true nature of their conversation. The general's words were carefully chosen to maintain the appearance of loyal service, while making clear that the military establishment could no longer support policies that were actively undermining Egypt's ability to defend itself. His suggestions for immediate reforms were presented as respectful counsel, but his underlying message was unmistakable: change course or face the consequences. Akhenaten's response to these military concerns demonstrated the complete transformation his worldview had undergone during the decade of his revolutionary reign. Where once he might have engaged with practical questions of strategy and resource allocation, he now spoke exclusively in theological terms that seemed to exist in a realm entirely separate from the political and military realities his kingdom faced. His conviction that spiritual truth would ultimately triumph over material force remained unshaken, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this faith was not shared by the people responsible for implementing his policies. The pharaoh's afternoon retreat to his private study had evolved into a daily escape from the mounting evidence of his revolution's failure. Surrounded by the theological treatises and architectural plans that represented his life's work, he could maintain the illusion that his ideas retained their original power and relevance. The manuscripts he continued to write explored increasingly abstract theological concepts that bore little relationship to the practical challenges facing his kingdom, as if intellectual complexity could somehow compensate for political ineffectiveness. His correspondence with the scattered remnants of the Atenist movement revealed how thoroughly his revolutionary theology had been abandoned even by its most committed supporters. Letters from former allies contained diplomatic suggestions that the pure monotheism of Atenist doctrine might need to accommodate traditional religious practices in order to maintain popular support. These gentle hints that his theological revolution was being diluted or abandoned entirely were perhaps more painful than outright opposition would have been. The royal workshops that had once produced masterpieces of revolutionary art were now operating with minimal staff and resources. The few sculptors and painters who remained worked with competent skill, but without the inspired creativity that had characterized the early years of artistic innovation. Their productions were technically adequate, but spiritually hollow, lacking the vital energy that had made Atenist art seem like a genuine breakthrough in human creative expression. The palace gardens provided Akhenaten with his most reliable source of comfort during these increasingly difficult days. The plants and flowers that had been carefully cultivated to demonstrate the Aten's creative power continued to follow their natural cycles, regardless of the human dramas playing out nearby. These living examples of divine creativity served as daily reminders that the theological truths underlying his revolution might possess eternal validity, even if their political implementation was proving to be temporary. Yet even these moments of natural tranquility were shadowed by signs of neglect that reflected the reduced resources available for maintenance and care. Irrigation channels that had once carried life-giving water to every corner of the garden were beginning to silt up from lack of attention. Exotic plants that had required careful tending were showing signs of stress as the gardening staff dwindled along with other palace personnel. The carefully maintained landscape was slowly returning to the desert conditions from which it had been rescued through human effort and divine inspiration. Evening meals in the royal dining chamber had become intimate family gatherings attended only by the pharaoh, queen, and their daughters. The elaborate ceremonial protocols that had once made each meal feel like a sacred ritual had been abandoned in favor of simple family conversations that focused on immediate concerns rather than grand philosophical discussions. The reduced circumstances actually created opportunities for more genuine emotional connection between family members. But this silver lining could not compensate for the larger tragedy that was unfolding around them. The royal children displayed a remarkable ability to adapt to their changing circumstances, while maintaining the dignity and composure expected of their royal status. The older princesses had developed a sophisticated understanding of political realities that allowed them to participate meaningfully in family discussions about the future. Their questions revealed both intellectual maturity and emotional resilience that would serve them well regardless of what fate awaited their father's kingdom. The youngest princess continued to provide moments of genuine joy and spontaneous laughter that reminded the entire family of what they were fighting to preserve. Her innocent games and childish observations served as precious interludes of normalcy in a world that was becoming increasingly surreal. Her very presence was a reminder that the ultimate purpose of any political system was to create conditions where human life could flourish in all its natural beauty and complexity. As darkness settled over the capital city, Akhenaten could observe from his palace windows a landscape that told the story of humanity's most ambitious attempt to reshape civilization according to divine truth. The magnificent temples and palaces that rose from the desert sands represented achievements in architecture, art, and urban planning that would influence human culture for millennia to come. Yet the empty streets and darkened buildings also testified to the practical difficulties of sustaining revolutionary change in the face of human nature's resistance to radical transformation. The pharaoh's evening prayers had evolved from expressions of confident thanksgiving into desperate appeals for divine guidance during circumstances that seemed to test the very foundations of his faith. His personal relationship with the Aten remained as intense as ever, but his conversations with divinity now focused more on requests for understanding of mysterious divine purposes than on celebrations of obvious blessings and clear direction. The royal bedtime routine had been simplified to accommodate the reduced palace staff, but it retained elements of ceremonial dignity that preserved the sense of continuity with Egypt's ancient traditions. The remaining servants performed their duties with quiet efficiency and genuine devotion, understanding that they were participating in rituals that connected them to thousands of years of royal service, regardless of the uncertain political circumstances surrounding their current employment. As Akhenaten prepared for sleep in chambers that seemed to grow larger and emptier with each passing night, he was surrounded by artistic treasures that represented the highest achievements of human creativity, inspired by divine truth. The wall paintings that depicted his family receiving the Aten's life-giving rays would be studied and admired by scholars throughout history as examples of revolutionary artistic innovation that captured universal human experiences of love, family, and spiritual seeking. The architectural innovations visible through his windows would influence building techniques throughout the ancient world and beyond, demonstrating that even failed political experiments could produce cultural achievements of lasting value. The urban planning principles that governed his capital's design would be studied by city builders for generations as examples of how human communities could be organized to reflect theological principles and aesthetic values. Yet the pharaoh understood with growing clarity that the political and social framework necessary to sustain these cultural achievements was dissolving despite his most determined efforts to preserve it. The kingdom that had once seemed destined to demonstrate the practical benefits of theological revolution was approaching a moment of reckoning that would determine whether any of his life's work could survive the forces that were gathering against it. The desert wind that whispered through the palace corridors carried with it the scent of distant sandstorms and the promise of changes that no human will could prevent or control. As sleep gradually overcame the revolutionary pharaoh, he could not know that the final act of his extraordinary drama was already beginning to unfold, or that the morning sun would rise upon a world where the forces of tradition and practical necessity were preparing to reclaim the kingdom he had transformed according to his vision of divine truth. The stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human civilizations, each one convinced of its own permanence and special destiny. Tomorrow's dawn would illuminate the beginning of the end for humanity's first great experiment in monotheistic government, as the weight of political reality finally overwhelmed even the most sincere attempts to reshape human society according to revolutionary spiritual vision. Spiritual, according to revolutionary. The 11th year of Akhenaten's reign dawned with the finality of a door closing on a magnificent dream. The pharaoh's morning awakening came not in the grand palace that had once housed the world's most revolutionary court, but in a modest chamber where the remaining servants moved with the careful precision of people attending to a dying king who refused to acknowledge his condition. The eastern windows that had once framed views of a bustling construction site now revealed a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The limestone temples and palaces stood complete in their architectural perfection, but they were monuments to abandonment rather than centers of living worship. Wild grasses had begun to sprout between the carefully laid paving stones, while desert sand accumulated in corners where human feet no longer walked with daily purpose. Akhenaten's morning communion with the Aten retained all its ritual solemnity, but the pharaoh now stood alone on his terrace, where once dozens of courtiers had gathered to witness the dawn ceremonies. The golden rays that touched his upturned face carried the same life-giving warmth they had always provided, yet somehow the divine presence felt more distant, as if the Aten itself was beginning to withdraw from a world that had rejected its revolutionary message. The royal breakfast was served by Kamwaset, an elderly steward whose loyalty had survived every crisis and disappointment of the past decade. His weathered hands arranged the morning meal with the same meticulous care he had always shown, but his movements carried the weight of profound sadness as he performed duties that had once required the coordination of dozens of palace workers. The golden vessels that held the pharaoh's food were polished to their usual brilliance, but they seemed to glow with desperate intensity, as if trying to maintain their magnificence through sheer force of will. Nefertiti's appearance in the dining chamber marked a rare moment of shared family time in a schedule that had become dominated by urgent private negotiations with the few remaining allies who might help secure her daughter's futures. The Queen's beauty remained undiminished by the trials of the past years, but her expressions carried depths of sorrow and determination that spoke of a woman preparing for sacrifices no mother should have to contemplate. Her conversations with her husband had evolved from passionate theological discussions to careful exchanges about immediate practical concerns, as if they were both learning to speak a new language of survival rather than revolution. The royal children who joined their parents for breakfast displayed a maturity that seemed both admirable and heartbreaking in its premature sophistication. The older princesses had learned to weigh their words carefully, understanding instinctively that casual remarks could have consequences in a world where loyalty had become a precious commodity. Their questions about the future were posed with diplomatic skill that would have impressed seasoned courtiers, but their eyes revealed the uncertainty of young people trying to understand why their world was crumbling around them. The morning administrative sessions brought fewer and fewer officials to the audience chamber with each passing week. The vast halls that had once echoed with the voices of provincial governors and foreign ambassadors now hosted meetings that could have been conducted in a private room. The reports that arrived spoke of regions that were effectively governing themselves, making decisions about taxation, justice, and defense without reference to royal authority that seemed increasingly theoretical rather than practical. A messenger from Memphis brought news that the ancient capital was experiencing a religious revival centered around the traditional gods that Akhenaten had tried so hard to supplant. Temples that had been converted to Atenist worship were being restored to their original purposes, while priests who had fled during the early years of religious revolution were returning to reclaim their ancestral roles. The message was delivered with diplomatic courtesy, but its underlying meaning was clear. Egypt was returning to the spiritual practices that had sustained it for millennia. Foreign correspondence painted an even more troubling picture of Egypt's diminished status in the international community. The Hittite king wrote with casual contempt about territorial adjustments that amounted to the annexation of Egyptian dependencies, while Mesopotamian rulers discussed trade agreements that treated Egypt as a minor partner rather than the dominant power it had been for generations. These diplomatic communications were addressed to Akhenaten personally, but their tone suggested that foreign courts were already looking beyond his reign toward whatever successor might prove more amenable to traditional diplomatic relationships. Military dispatches described a defense establishment that was collapsing under the weight of practical impossibilities. Garrison commanders reported that their troops were deserting in such numbers that some fortresses could no longer be adequately manned. Supply lines that had once moved resources efficiently across vast distances were breaking down as regional authorities diverted materials to their own uses rather than supporting central military objectives. The professional army that had once projected Egyptian power across 3 continents was fragmenting into isolated units whose primary concern was their own survival rather than imperial defense. General Horemheb's afternoon audience carried the weight of final ultimatum disguised as respectful counsel. The old soldier's words were chosen with diplomatic precision, but his message was unmistakably clear. The military establishment could no longer support policies that were actively destroying Egypt's ability to defend itself. His suggestions for immediate reforms were presented as loyal advice, but his underlying position was that fundamental changes were necessary, regardless of the pharaoh's theological convictions. Akhenaten's response revealed how completely his perspective had been transformed by a decade of revolutionary idealism. Where practical men saw military necessity and political reality, he perceived spiritual tests and opportunities for deeper faith. His conviction that divine truth would ultimately triumph over material force remained absolute, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that this faith was not shared by the people responsible for implementing his vision in the physical world. The pharaoh's afternoon retreat to his private study had become a daily pilgrimage to a shrine of abandoned dreams. The theological manuscripts that covered his writing desk represented thousands of hours of intellectual labor devoted to exploring the implications of monotheistic belief for human society. These works would eventually be studied by scholars as remarkable examples of ancient philosophical thinking, but they had failed utterly in their immediate purpose of providing practical guidance for governing a real kingdom facing concrete challenges. His correspondence with scattered supporters of Atena's theology revealed the extent to which his revolutionary movement had been abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. Former allies wrote diplomatically about the need to accommodate traditional religious practices in order to maintain popular support, while others had simply stopped writing altogether. The network of believers that had once seemed destined to transform human consciousness had dissolved into isolated individuals, trying to preserve fragments of what had been a comprehensive vision. The royal workshops continued to produce examples of the artistic style that would be remembered as Akhenaten's most enduring contribution to human culture. But the craftsmen who created these works labored with the mechanical competence of people completing assignments rather than pursuing inspired creativity. Their sculptures and paintings were technically proficient but spiritually hollow, lacking the vital energy that had once made Atenist art seem like a genuine breakthrough in aesthetic expression. The palace gardens provided the pharaoh with his most reliable source of peace during these increasingly difficult days. But even these carefully cultivated spaces showed signs of the neglect that was creeping into every aspect of royal life. Irrigation systems that had once carried life-giving water to every corner of the landscape were beginning to fail from lack of maintenance, while exotic plants that had required careful attention were showing stress from inadequate care. The garden that had once symbolized the harmony between human cultivation and divine creativity was slowly returning to the desert conditions from which it had been rescued through sustained effort and resources. evening meals in the royal dining chamber had become intimate family gatherings that preserved elements of ceremonial dignity despite their reduced circumstances. The conversations that took place around the dinner table focused on immediate concerns rather than the grand philosophical discussions that had once characterized royal family life. But they also created opportunities for more genuine emotional connection between parents and children who were learning to value each other's company in ways that prosperity had never taught them. As the final rays of sunlight faded over Akhenaten's abandoned capital, the heretic pharaoh who had dared to challenge 3,000 years of tradition found himself alone with his revolutionary dream. His great experiment in monotheistic rule would crumble within months of his death, erased so thoroughly by his successors that his very name was chiseled from monuments across Egypt. Yet in those empty temples and weathered reliefs, something eternal remained, a testament to one man's extraordinary vision of divine truth that would echo through history long after his kingdom had returned to dust beneath the desert sands.